Welcome, everyone. This is Talk Back. It's February 16th, 2024, and we are in the middle of Black History Month, a very important month in our calendar because we are still coming to grips in our country with the issues of race and racism. And some people think that we're moving in some ways backwards and not forwards. Well, we have the perfect person to speak about this. Uh, Let me introduce a Connecticut professor and famous author, Manisha Sinha. Hi, Manisha. It's so nice to have you today.
Thank you, Sheila, for having me.
Yes, let me introduce you. Let everybody know something about your background. So, Manisha is the James L. and Shirley Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. Your interests lie in histories of slavery, abolition, and feminism, and in the history and legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. You have authored The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics, and Ideology in antebellum South Carolina, and you have won multiple awards for a book published in 2016, The Slave's Cause: A History of Abolition. You were born in India. Uh, Manisha was born in India and received her PhD from Columbia University, and your dissertation was nominated for a Bancroft Prize. And The Slave's Cause won the 19th annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize, among many other awards. And Manisha was named in the top 25 women in higher education and beyond. So your credentials speak so well of the information that you're going to help us with. And I want to show people a copy of your book, The Slave's Cause, which is one of the best books in the history, because you there you go, perfect. The Slave's Cause: A History of Abolition, because you uh, talked about how we always talk about abolition in terms of the white people's fight for abolition when it was the slaves' cause, right?
Exactly. Thank you, Sheila, for that generous introduction. And yes, I do reimagine abolition as a radical interracial social movement that included both whites and blacks, men and women, and most importantly, the enslaved themselves. When we think of some of the most famous abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman, and there were many more like them, they were all former slaves, and they came to becoming leading orators and tacticians in the abolition movement. So I do emphasize the role of African Americans, both free and enslaved, in the movement.
Right. And now I want you to show us the new book that you say is coming out very soon, the next couple of months, maybe March or next month. Tell us about it. Show us the cover if you can.
So this is The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic. It is coming out from Libright. It's a history of Reconstruction from 1860 to 1920. So it imagines a much longer history of Reconstruction. And I argue that the 19th Amendment, which was passed well after the fall of Reconstruction in 1920, that gave women the right to vote, should be seen as the last Reconstruction constitutional amendment because it was very much modeled after the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870 to give Black men the right to vote.
Right. And even though, when was the first Seneca Conference? Was that 1848?
Yes, the Senate
Yes.
Conference is in 1848. And of course, even before that, there were women who were fighting for the right to vote. We have now, historians have done a lot of research and have said that even though Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony privileged the Seneca Falls Convention, really there were many abolitionists, feminists, who were fighting for equal rights, including the right to vote before that moment, iconic moment. And also that maybe the 1850 Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, should really properly be seen as the first big national convention for women's
Right.
rights.
Well, I bring that up because I have read, and you know, that Frederick Douglass attended the Seneca Falls Convention. and was very much advocating for women's rights, and how the women's movement was very upset with the 15th Amendment because it gave the right to vote to uh, freed slaves with blacks, not women, right?
So, yes, it's a long story. The history of women's rights, as I write in my book, The Slave Scores, I have a chapter called The Woman Question. You can really trace it coming out of the abolition movement. And before the Civil War, these two movements for Black rights and women's rights, they kind of intersected. Most feminists were abolitionists, even though most abolitionists may not have been feminists. And
Mm,
it actually created a divide in the movement between abolitionists who were more radical, led by people like William Lloyd Garrison and then later Frederick Douglass, of course, who supported women's rights. But there were others who thought that it was too much to ask for both an end to slavery and women's rights, and that would compromise the movement, that it would not be successful. So there was a bit of division over this issue before the Civil War. But during Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, when the 15th Amendment is passed, it gives just Black men the right to vote and
right,
not women. And even before that, the 14th Amendment introduced the word male into the US Constitution for the first time. And this led some women, who were led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, to oppose both the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, Frederick Douglass and most African American women supported the 14th and 15th Amendment because they felt it was necessary and as a first step towards enfranchising women. Um, and Stanton and Anthony then made some questionable political choices, aligning with some racist Democrats. For your viewers, I should tell them that in the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, it was the
right.
party of liberalism. The Democrats represented the South and their allies in the North. They believed in states' rights and they defended slavery, and they tended to be pretty racist. So everything we know about the political parties today, we should just flip it for the 19th century. But Stanton and Anthony allied with some racist Democrats who opposed Reconstruction and
Right,
opposed
right.
Black rights, and that resulted in a real split between some abolitionist feminists led by women like Lucy Stone and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a Black feminist, and another group led by Stanton and Anthony. And that division proved fatal for the women's movement because they don't come back together until the 1890s. And only then does the movement for women's suffrage really take off,
Right.
ending with the 19th Amendment.
Right. So important, the comment you made about the Republican Party being the party of Lincoln, the party more of abolition, and the Democratic Party being the party of slavery and being the party of anti-movement on civil rights. And the fact that in the 20th century, President Lyndon Johnson, who was a Southerner, and when most of the Southern states were Republicans, their politicians were Republicans fighting civil rights, when that law was finally passed, one of the civil rights laws was passed, didn't President Johnson say, there goes the South as far as the Democratic Party is concerned, right? And there was a huge transfer of Republicans in the South becoming, Democrats in the South becoming Republicans, right?
Yes, that's one of the ironies of history. There's a huge partisan realignment during the civil rights movement and its aftermath, when the Democratic Party loses at least much of the white South. Because many of them are opposed to the civil rights movement, they're opposed to dismantling racial segregation. And the irony is that today the Republican Party's base is in the South, in the very states where Lincoln did not even appear in the ballot in 1860.
Right,
So you
right.
can really flip party loyalties. There are a lot of people of bad faith today who will say, oh, that the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, it's the party of states' rights.
Yeah,
Yes, maybe in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, the Democratic Party has become the party of civil rights, and the Republican Party has fashioned itself as a kind of virtually neo-Confederate force, because when those Confederate monuments, which most Civil War historians like me recommended should come down, we should not be celebrating racist traitors to the American Republic. That's not how you do history. That's not taking down history. That's taking down bad commemoration and bad memories, and kind of a misinterpretation of history. There were many Republican politicians, including Trump, who said that these Confederate monuments should not come down. So it's an irony that the party of Lincoln is now a
Right.
party that supports this kind of lost cause
Mm,
apology
right.
for
And
war.
then in the mid 20th century, you had politicians like Nixon, who said it quietly, called it the silent majority, but it was really a whistle call to the anti-civil rights people. And I remember people think that Ronald Reagan was a fabulous president. He started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and I wonder why. That's what, right?
Yes, that was setting. There were all these dog whistles going out from, of course, the Republican Party, and there were kind of the race baiting kind of electoral strategies that had been applied or used by the Democrats. The Democrats used to call the Republicans the Black Republicans in the 19th century because of their anti-slavery stance. And it was kind of, and Lincoln was always race baited by his Democratic opponents, including the famous Lincoln Douglas debates. What's shocking is the modern Republican Party did indeed develop this Southern strategy that was conceived of by Nixon, as you mentioned in your question, to really get the South, but also get racist Democrats from the North, and form a new winning coalition and majority based on really stoking racial divisions. There's a sad history of this in contemporary American politics. You mentioned Reagan going to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where civil rights activists had been murdered, and which celebrated the resistance to the civil rights movement. Then he went to Bitburg in Germany, which was a Nazi cemetery. So those were all kinds of dog whistles. And now we are at a stage when, anti Semitism, anti Black racism has really been inflamed, as we saw in 2017 in Charlottesville with these sort of neo Nazis marching to defend Robert E. Lee's monument in Charlottesville, Virginia, shouting, Jews will not replace us. This is really sad that in contemporary United States that we have to fight those battles again. We are not back where we were, but that those forces have to constantly be confronted and defeated. That those threatening the American Republic, they don't die down. Even after that
Mm.
awful Civil War, it sort of continues those battles. And there are just too many examples in contemporary politics, whether it was Reagan's welfare queen or George H.W. Bush's Willie Horton ads, all these. And now with Trump, of course, it's all out in the open. They don't hide under the rock anymore. They are all out, and they openly say things that are fascist, neo-Nazi, even celebrating the old Confederacy.
Right. Well, I think when I was a student many years ago in high school and then even in college, we always thought of the American experiment as yes, we started out with very uncomfortable truths about slavery, racism, and all the ills. But the story of America is moving forward, bringing more and more people into equality, into freedom, into privileges, right? Into better lives. That feeling is gone today. Am I right to think that people are thinking for the first time? I look at the abortion decision. How many times in our history have we had a decision that goes backwards in time?
Right.
Erases the gains that we've had. I always thought that American history was always going up slowly, perhaps, maybe some roots back for a little bit, but never such a turn to the past. What do you say to that?
Yes, we like to think that American democracy is always progressing and that it's a kind of a linear movement towards greater and greater freedoms and rights. Unfortunately, if you look at American history, that's not necessarily been true all the time. And that's why I call my book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, because we had a moment after the Civil War when you had genuine interracial democracy in the South, and those governments were taken down by a regime of domestic racist terror by groups like the Ku Klux Klan and others. Rights were taken away. Black men were given the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment said equality before the law for everyone and had provisions against those who commit insurrection against the government of the United States, which are now being revisited today in the case against Trump, and had provisions that you would lose representation in Congress if you indulged in voter suppression. None of those were implemented, and in fact, they were overthrown by the establishment of Jim Crow and disfranchisement in the South. And we had to refight those battles in the 20th century with the civil rights movement, which was really the second reconstruction of American democracy. And today we see a black backlash against that, a backlash against the New Deal state, a backlash against the civil rights movement, a backlash against women's rights, against human rights. It's become fashionable again amongst certain groups to be openly nativist, to be openly racist and misogynistic. And we think we need to fight those battles again because American democracy has never really progressed in a linear way. There have been moments in our history where democracy has been overthrown, and nothing better illustrates that than the South. Between the overthrow, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement, it was not a democratic region. It was a region based on racial apartheid, on
Right,
segregation. And so, that can happen. Our history shows us. So I
right.
think we should be complacent.
I see it again in the civil rights movement in the, well, we talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, that 1896 decision that said it was okay to be separate and equal and separate railroad cars, right? But then we go to 1954 and Brown versus Board, and it says no, segregation is not equal, separate is not equal. But from 1954 till today, we have had so much backlash. We have never made an integrated society in our schools or in other ways, right? They have been so fierce in the backlash and in the determination not to do it. At one point, didn't the court say, with all due deliberate speed? And what has happened? Fight after fight. And I'm telling you, I was astonished when my husband and I took a tour in Selma. Those schools are not integrated in this town of Selma, notwithstanding the wonderful edifice, the bridge that represents so much about the civil rights movement. The schools are still mostly actually Black population, and the white people go to have established private schools for the most part. So talk about that. The fact, even that promise in 1954 that integration would help bring our country together has never really materialized, has it?
Not fully. There has been some progress, but certainly I should also mention that the South, the slave South, did not have a public school system. We had that in the North. Most areas in the South did not have it. It was only the Reconstruction interracial governments that introduced the public school system in the South. And then, too, the question of integration was raised. And there was a lot of criticism against it by Southern elites who always had access to education, but certainly it was not there for Black people, certainly not there for enslaved people or for poor whites. And the public school system has always been under attack by conservatives and reactionaries because it is an equalizing force in American civic life, in American society and for American democracy. So when you have Brown versus Board of Education that declares segregation illegal, a lot of whites in the South flew to private academies if they had the
Mhm.
money to do that. And the public school systems became predominantly poor and black and underfunded. And in the South, again, there's this rhetoric against big government, but it's really to starve communities of government services. You have a crisis of not having clean water. You would have a crisis of not having access to good schools. Certainly this is, racial segregation, but it is also economic, because a lot of people don't realize that poor people who may not have access to private academies, and that's why they develop all these strange ideas about vouchers and charter schools and this and that, because the aim is to destroy the common school, what was
Mm,
in New England as the common school system, as a
right.
leg for ordinary people. And, that's one of the great achievements of public school systems, but they're constantly under attack by those who would not like to have equal educational opportunity across class and race lines.
Fascinating. So let's go back to the beginning because it's Black History Month, and so much of what you're saying, most American students are not studying about that or have a misunderstanding about a lot of issues in um, racism in America and Black history. So tell us, what is the origin of Black History Month? How did it get started? What are its goals?
So now I feel, and even this history is now under attack, but now, certainly since the Second World War made racism unfashionable in the academy, we have been telling better histories of the United States since then. Um, and before that, the academy was really dominated, certainly the study of Civil War and slavery, by lost cause mythology, by racist depictions of slavery, dominated by Southern historians, Southern white historians, some of whom were direct descendants of Southern slaveholding planters. Um, it was African Americans outside the academy who continued to write their histories in a different manner. And you have people like Carter G. Woodson, of course, the historically Black universities and colleges that were founded during Reconstruction to serve Black people. A lot of the sort of early Black intellectuals and academics came out of that system. And they wanted to write accurate histories of the Civil War, of slavery, of abolition, and Reconstruction. And interestingly enough, today we read their works, but we don't read those biased racist accounts written in mainstream academy in the United States in the early 20th century. So Carter G. Woodson founded an association for the study of Negro history, as it was called. Now it's called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And he decided to found Black History Month to get rid of all these kind of racist aspersions and racist depictions and flat out lies about the history of slavery in this country. And he founded this organization, and they started celebrating what they call Negro History Week in February because they wanted to commemorate both Lincoln's birthday and that of Frederick Douglass.
Oh,
Negro History Week became Black History Month for the entire month of February. But it was really, they chose February because it was the Lincoln's birthday and the birthday of, or at least Frederick Douglass said that his birthday was 14th February. He didn't know when he was born, and he just chose Valentine's Day, the 14th February, as the date of his birth. So that was the idea, and now we commemorate Black History Month, we commemorate Women's History Month, we commemorate Asian American History Month, and all kinds, just telling a fuller, richer, and more diverse history of our country. And a lot of people think we are kind of displacing other histories, and that's not necessarily correct. No one has stopped teaching about the founders, and we never will. No one has stopped teaching about, the Declaration of Independence or the founding documents of the American Republic, the Constitution, or the history and the importance of somebody like Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. But we now do write broader and more fuller histories, more complex and more nuanced histories rather than mythic histories, right? We are not there to forward any political project, but we are there to look at the evidence as historians and tell an accurate history of the United States. As Abraham Lincoln famously put it in his second annual message to Congress in 1862, he said, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history."
So let's start then with some of the truths about Black history, American history that are not taught, or that now we have a project by so many states to change the history, to get away from these inconvenient, uncomfortable truths, as they're calling it. So let's start from the beginning. Was our country founded on the basis of white supremacy? Is it okay to say that? And what does that mean?
Well, I think it's really important that we don't go from one simple historical narrative to another. We had a very simple mythic history of the United States, and that there was no problem, and if people were excluded, they were simply gradually included, and everything progressed without any contestation. In fact, if you look at American history, there's a lot of conflict and contestation. We fought a civil war over slavery, in which more Americans died than the two world wars, the Vietnam
Right.
War
Yeah.
and the Korean War combined. So there was enormous conflict over these issues in American history. And we should look back at the period of the founding, the American Revolution. I think it's important to do that because the anniversary is coming up soon of 1776 in 2026. And understand that there was conflict and contestation over these issues even then. The nation is literally born half slave, half free, right? The northern states move towards emancipation, but slavery persists in the South. So I think it's not good to completely flatten American history and say everything was about racism and white supremacy, because it wasn't. There were many African Americans who fought with the Patriots. There are some historians who say the American Revolution was fought to protect slavery and it was all about racism. I do not agree with that interpretation. I find it as simple and as unnuanced as some of the older mythic notions of the American Revolution. I'm more interested because people always say, oh, those were people of their times. No, there were people fighting for the right, abolitionists mainly, right from the start. And there were some founders who at least lend the prestige of their names to the abolition movement. People, it's mostly from the North. But you even had somebody like a slaveholding Virginian, like George Washington, who's one of the few Southern founding fathers who actually, in his will, um,
Freedom.
enslaved people he owned after his wife's death, though, right?
Mm.
He wanted to make sure that he didn't free them immediately, but at least that gesture spoke to some sense that it was wrong to have slavery in a republic. And he does other things like pursue his own enslaved runaway slave Una Judge all the way to New Hampshire, and New Hampshire says, sorry, you may be the president of the United States, but she is free in New Hampshire and we are not going to send her back to you. And Washington didn't want to be embarrassed in public about this issue, but he pursued her, his runaway.
Right.
So he's a man of contradictions too. So it's really important for us to tell those complex stories, that we don't go from one simple story to its polar opposite simple story, because that's also, in my opinion, not completely accurate.
Okay. So another issue, a few years ago, the 1619 project came out through the New York Times and the author. And it was a sensation, and so many of the old line historians were upset. You can't set American history at 1619, it's 1776. Talk about that, Manisha. Again, why can't we have, as you say, the complexity of both?
Exactly. And, I should mention that one of the essays in the 1619 project by Jamil Bowie mentions my first book, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery,
Oh,
looking at the politics of slavery. And I have to commend the 1619 project I had a wonderful conversation with Nicole Hannah Jones when she came to the University of Connecticut to talk about the 1619 project. So I have to commend her and all the people who wrote in the project. Some of them were scholars themselves, um, who tried to bring some of the latest research in history to a broader audience. You know, we write our books, but how many people are reading them? But a lot of people read the 1619 project. And I think that was important because a lot of Americans don't realize how important slavery was to American political and economic development. And I think the reason why she began in 1619 is because that's the first set of enslaved Africans who land on British North American mainland colonies. I should say that again, because of course there were enslaved Africans in Florida at that time and other parts of North America that were brought by the Spanish and others to this country, to this continent. Um, she began in 1619 because she, I think, sees that as a founding moment for what becomes the United States, these British mainland North American colonies, and it's Virginia, it's Jamestown, it's a founding moment. But there's another founding moment, and that's Plymouth Rock, too, right?
Mhm.
And so there are many things in the 1619 project that some of the old guard historians were unhappy about. Some of it, I think, was just like they didn't like the idea of journalists doing history when they had been doing it for so long. But some of it, I think, was slightly, I would say, I think we should treat slightly unfair, I should say. I think we should treat the 1619 project the way we treat any history book. We don't agree. When I teach many books in my graduate seminars, my graduate students dissect those books. They talk about what they agree with, what they disagree with. They praise certain things, they criticize certain things. And I would say the same holds true for something like the 1619 project. Um, I was not one of those historians, excuse me, who felt the need to publicly criticize them because I thought their goals were praiseworthy, even though I may not agree with them on each and everything that they said.
But at bottom, what is the fear? What is the overreaction to something like that? And then get into the whole concept of critical race theory, which, as far as I know, is not taught in schools to our school children. What is all of the fervor about that? What is it? And why are people so excited about not allowing their children to learn it? I don't get that. And at bottom, there must be a racist reason for it. What is it?
So I think that the criticism of the 1619 project from some of the historians were very specific. This notion, there is a theory based on some recent writings by some Black and white historians that the American Revolution was fought to only protect slavery. Now, certainly you could find evidence of that, mainly in the southern plantation colonies, maybe a little bit even a colony like New Jersey. But to make that blanket statement made some historians uncomfortable. Or there were specific questions about the role of Lincoln and other things that were, that people debated. Um, I think that is different. Those criticisms, I think, are different uh, than the kinds of criticism that are coming from the right today, who are really not interested in particular points of history or scholarship. They just want to create a racist bugbear and really mislead well-meaning people even sometimes. Um, you know, uh, Most Americans are very patriotic, and most Americans do not like the idea that that somehow American history is only about slavery. And I think by raising these kind of bugbears, racist bugbears, very sort of bad faith actors, people like Christopher Rufo, who made up this controversy over critical race theory, um, which we know is not taught in schools. He used it as a short form to attack the teaching of any Black history. of any history that has to do with slavery. And critical race theory is taught in law schools for law students to try and understand that why is it that racial disparities continue to exist in the United States, both economically, but also in terms of law enforcement and mass incarceration, when we have formal civil and political equality. And there are many different people who've written about critical race theory, legal theorists, famous writers, etc. But it sounds kind of scary, and it became kind of a buzzword for, as I said, bad actors like Rufo and others who used it to try and censor US history, try and censor the teaching of slavery, try and censor African American history. It was taken to an extreme by groups in Florida in particular, and by Ron DeSantis, who has single-handedly, I think, tried to destroy public higher education in Florida and bring in very motivated, politically biased kind of curriculum. Now, this is ironic because they say they're fighting against bias, but they are the ones who are doing the censorship. They're the ones who are bringing in ahistorical, incorrect, biased understandings. They're doing away with the study of sociology, doing away with the study of slavery. There are other groups, they're not exactly grassroots groups, they're right wing activists who create a certain kind of illusion that they're representing a whole lot of people. They're not. They're a group of right-wing activists, like the Moms for Liberty, that was shown to have close contacts with authoritarian and neo-fascist groups like the Proud Boys, and whose founders are now, they kept talking about trying to protect their children from certain ideas about sex or gender, which they thought deemed dangerous. But the founders were actually involved in some horrendous sexual scandals. So the hypocrisy of many of these people is extreme. They do not like experts because experts will never toe a propaganda line. And it really does, as a 19th century and a Civil War historian, it reminds me of what Southerners were doing before the Civil War. They were banning books from the North because of their anti-slavery content.
Mhm.
So this banning of books and things is not new. It's what authoritarians do. It's what the Nazis did. They burned books. Southern slaveholders censored books from the North and from Europe if they thought that they had any anti slavery content. They did not let enslaved people read because they didn't want them to read and be fit only to perform hard physical labor. So, these people are modern iterations of what happened then. After the Civil War, you had groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy who rewrote textbooks in the South talking about how wonderful slavery was. We have modern day politicians in the Republican Party who want to talk about the benefits of slavery and the skills that enslaved people learned under slavery. Yeah, there were certain slave artisans who had skills, but it was not because
Right.
slavery was a benign institution. So they really, as a historian, I would say I'm very uncomfortable with these groups, very uncomfortable with book bans. I think we should trust teachers, the experts, to know when it is appropriate to introduce what materials in the classroom. And the moment we have bad faith political actors trying to sow racial divisions, trying to sow other kinds of divisions, and make the study of history really more of a propaganda, national propaganda, rather than a serious study of a serious topic, we are in trouble as a nation.
Yeah. So my questions are: I'm looking at the news. You yourself were threatened and needed protection from people arguing with you and threatening you because of your views against something that Trump had said, and about the Charlottesville issues. I mean, we're living in a world of threats, and I don't know if it's just Trump and his influence, but I'm wondering, I've read more than 20, 30 states are passing state laws designating what subjects will be taught in schools to their children, how they will be taught in schools, using the expression no critical race theory, no woke, WOKE, that's another word they use, no divisive concepts, nothing that would make young children feel uncomfortable if they thought they may have been perpetrating slavery or inequality. I mean, why don't they put themselves in the shoes of the people that were victims instead of the, I mean, I don't know. My point is, why is this happening now, Manisha? What is in the air for the fervency of this now? Why now in this stage of American history are we getting, and I also want to add, I've read that there are studies that show that 7, 8% only of American high school students know anything about why the Civil War started or can recite the Declaration of Independence or, yeah, or the Constitution and so forth.
That is shocking, and that's dangerous for American democracy. You know, we have a republic based on civic nationalism, you know, that is based on knowing our ideals, the principles on which the American republic is founded, and our history. And if we don't know it, we will lose the republic. The one thing you need is an informed and educated citizenry in order to uphold democracy and uphold a democratic republicanism. I got death threats, I think, mainly because I think Trump has unleashed some of the worst demons in American society. He flames and encourages this kind of reasoning. I just wrote a very innocuous piece comparing Donald Trump to Andrew Johnson, the president who succeeded Lincoln. And it was just a historical comparison piece, but apparently it became the most downloaded article on CNN, which was not normal because their news articles tend to be more downloaded. And I got a death threat from somebody who called my home and told me, I'm coming to kill you. Turns out this young man, Matthew Erickson, lives in Texas. He was nowhere in Massachusetts, but my lovely little New England town of Sturbridge, the local police was in my office in my home in 5 minutes, and they immediately encouraged me to figure out who was calling me because there was no call ID, and they got a court order. They figured out who it was. They targeted him, and now there's an outstanding warrant against this man if he ever comes to Massachusetts. Of course, the people in Texas have done nothing against him, but apparently he has 4 outstanding warrants against him in 4 different states. And when I go to Texas, I get security detail when I give lectures, which is hilarious because, you know, I'm just a historian. I'm not a political figure. And I think it enrages people who have a certain ethnic, un-American conception of who is an American, that someone like me, who is an immigrant, born in India, can be educated in and write about American history. I've never been questioned in my nearly 30 years of teaching, either by my students or anyone, about what I write and, you know, all my expertise. But I think in social media, I've been attacked in horrible racist and misogynistic ways. As I said, Trump has unleashed these people, and now Twitter is owned by a man, a billionaire, who encourages this kind of fascism. And so you get a lot of this blowback. I just delete and cancel and block them. And after the death threat, I thought maybe I won't talk about this anymore. That, you know, I didn't want to, you know, the police put security cameras in my driveway and they were circling my house because nothing happens in my quiet little town, but this was big for them. So they were literally patrolling my house.
Yeah.
And I don't want my family to be put into jeopardy, certainly not my children. And I thought I will not write anymore and I'll be quiet publicly about things, about current day politics. And my husband was the one who told me, no, absolutely not. You should never stop. You should never let them intimidate you into silence. And he's German. And he, unlike the United States and Germany, for the most part, they really did come to a reckoning with their awful history, with the awful history of Nazism. You will find no statues to Nazis.
Right.
It is criminal to wave the Nazi flag. You have the Confederate battle flag in many southern states' flags that has been taken down only recently. And so, he was the one who says, the moment people stop talking about this or not standing up for the truth and what is right, you end up with the Nazis
Mm.
and you will never stop. And I was really surprised to hear my husband say that. But as a German, someone of German origin, he really knew the cost, the price for being quiet and being silent, not just for perpetrating evil, but for also being a bystander to evil.
Right. And so I still want you to answer the question, why now? What is in the air in our
So
culture today?
I
Is it
I think
Trump? I know Trump is a big part of it, but it's got to
that
be more than that.
he's given people permission to be openly racist, but it's not just Trump. What's dangerous today in the United States is that we have a two-party system, which means either party should be able to assume political power and should be faithful to our constitution and should be faithful to our republic. But now we have one entire party. People call them MAGA Republicans, Trump Republicans, but virtually the entire party is hostage to this man who fashions himself as an authoritarian leader, and who really, by the 14th Amendment, should not be allowed to run on any presidential ballot. I was one of the historians who signed an amicus brief
Mm.
against Trump in the Supreme Court case, which will be decided. Given the way the Supreme Court has always emasculated and misread and misinterpreted Reconstruction laws and amendments. You mentioned Plessy versus Ferguson. That's a good example. There are many others. I wouldn't be surprised if they uphold his right, even the so-called liberal judges, to run for elections.
Yeah, looks
At
like that. Yeah.
he should be disqualified because there are very minimal requirements to run for the presidency. You have to be 35 years of age, you have to be native born, which means I can't run for the presidency of the United States, and rightly so, because it's in the Constitution. And at a minimum, you should not have incited or given aid and comfort to a domestic insurrection against the government of the United States after having sworn an oath of office to uphold the United States Constitution. And people said, well, that doesn't apply to the president. No, we are a republic. We are not a monarchy where the king can do no wrong. A president is as much an officer of the federal government as any other and has sworn an oath of office to uphold the US Constitution. And so, most historians, there's broad-based agreement. There were two amicus
Right.
briefs that we put together, a group of historians where I signed one, another group of historians where they cited my forthcoming book in their amicus brief. And I really think we need to relearn the lessons of the Civil War and Reconstruction if we are to save our republic.
I know. It doesn't look like the Supreme Court is going to go the way that you would like. They're going to probably come up with some loophole about how that amendment needs to be implemented by a congressional
Yeah.
law. I
And
think they'll do something.
there's no self-execution. Like if I run for the presidency, I don't need the Congress to pass a law saying, no, Manisha Sinha, you can't run
Right, right. Yeah,
because you're not native
yeah,
born. These are self-executing, their requirements, their disqualification
right.
in
And
the
I was, yeah,
and the second question that you asked about woke, I always tell my students that being woke is good. It's being
right.
awake to injustice.
Aware, yeah,
And I give them the example of the wide awakes. The wide awakes were groups in the North who were supporting Lincoln for the presidency. They were wide awake to the evils of slavery. They were wide awake to the slave power, the insidious ways in which Southern slaveholders were trying to perpetuate and extend slavery. So
right,
we today are the inheritors of the wide awakes, the woke groups.
right.
And I wish the Republican politicians like DeSantis, who proudly said woke comes to die in Florida, realizes how much he's betraying the very founding principles of his own party.
Well, yeah. Um, so in the remaining time we have left, what I want you to do is tell us what are the principles of in Black history that we should be teaching, that should form the basis of a good education for our students, let's say for our high school students in America. What should we know? What are the myths that we should erase and know the truth of?
When people think of Black history, they think, oh, we are just going to be talking about slavery and oppression, etc. And yes, indeed, you must talk about the long histories of slavery, its afterlives, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching, racist terror, massacres, all that happened in order that it never happens again, never again, right? But Black history is not just about that. Black history is also the history of the Black radical tradition, going back to people like Frederick Douglass, and even before him, to other Black writers and thinkers and activists and abolitionists. Phyllis Wheatley, who's not just one of the first Black women to be ever published, she's one of the first American women to be ever published. All this is a matter of pride, not just for Black Americans, but all Americans. And we should be able to talk about that history. It's We should be able to talk about the history of oppression, but also about the history of abolition and about the civil rights movement and its achievements. I think many times we tend to become very one-sided, and as I've always said, there's always conflict, there's always complexity, and that's true in Black history too. We should be telling all parts of Black history. We should be talking about Black achievements. We should also be talking about the history of racist oppression, so that we do not replicate the mistakes of the past, so that we build on our achievements. The fight for Black freedom in this country is very much connected to the expansion of American democracy as a whole. It is because of that Black freedom Black struggle for equality, that many of us today, whether it's women, whether it's immigrants like me, enjoy certain civil and political rights. National birthright citizenship comes about because of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution passed after the fall of slavery. We all benefit from the Black struggle. It makes a central contribution to upholding American democracy. And that's the part of the story that also needs to be told, besides the story of oppression. And if people like DeSantis and Rufo and all their ilk understood that clearly, and were not trying to make political capital by sowing political racial divisions, which is very dangerous. I think they would understand that they are betraying and are in fact traitors to our founding ideals and to the republic itself. And today we have a man and an entire party that is would rather defend Putin than our own government. I mean,
Right.
it's shocking
It
to
is.
think about it. They would rather betray their own country and sing the praises of dictators abroad, people like Viktor Orban of Hungary, or Vladimir Putin, who has just killed one of his opponents. We just heard Navalny died in prison. Is that the kind of dystopia that these people are imagining for the United States? As Lincoln famously put it, when it comes to that, I would rather live in an autocratic country than one that pretends to uphold ideals
Mhm.
while following these autocratic ideas. And when Lincoln famously said that in a speech on the eve of the Civil War. And maybe I would just recommend that on Black History Month, we read Frederick Douglass, we read Abraham Lincoln, we read the abolitionists, a plug for my own book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, that does not shy away from the oppressions of slavery, but also gives us certain figures to admire in American history, those who fought for the right, right then and there. This notion that somehow we are woke and those people just accepted slavery is simply wrong. They've always been decent Americans who stood up for the right.
Thank you. Well, Manisha, it's always wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for your courage in needing to speak out and for telling us the truth all the time. I just hope that the teachers out there who are under attack have the courage. I read stories about teachers resigning, um, having threats to themselves and their families, and they don't want to go on. We need more people of courage and more people to support them, more parents to support the good teachers who want us to learn the truth. So thank you so much on Black History Month, and good luck with your new book. I'm sure it will be a great success as your previous book, The Slave's Cause, was. Thank you so much, Manisha, and goodbye, everyone, for Talk Back. See you next time. Bye. Thank you so much. Bye.